Thank you for joining me today on Coffee With. Of course, we're back at the Duff Green Mansion and Bed and Breakfast with the owner, Harley Caldwell. We're moving our way around the mansion, around your own. You live here. This is your home, and we're in the other end of the ballroom.
We're in the Victorian game room.
Victorian game room. The red
Victorian game room.
Okay, so tell us about this.
All right, we finish up our tour of the house here. We talk about what happened after the war came to Vicksburg. We start with meeting these two gentlemen in these portraits. This gentleman in the gray is General John C. Pemberton for the Confederate Army. General Pemberton defended Vicksburg. And then we are the most liberal antebellum home in the state of Mississippi, in that we have a portrait of Ulysses S. Grant, but we keep him hidden behind this door. But the war was coming to Vicksburg. Duff knew the war was coming to Vicksburg. Grant just couldn't take Vicksburg. Duff knew the war was coming. So when Pemberton arrived to defend the town, Duff took the side balconies off the house. Robin, I'm hoping we'll shoot some outside footage.
Yeah, we will.
Get the front balconies, which are original to the house, the side balconies, which are reproductions. Duff took those side balconies off the house, he melted them down, and he made mini balls out of them. And he presented those mini balls to General Pemberton to, of course, garner favor with Pemberton and of the Confederacy by extension. I believe that at the same time, Duff was brokering cotton to the Union. If he wasn't, he was the luckiest son of a gun on the face of the earth, because the entire Union fleet was out in the river. The entire Navy, the Union Navy is in the river. They're firing towards the courthouse, which is 2.5 blocks south of here, and they're not firing stealth bombers. They're firing cannonball, and those cannonball are just going wherever they go. So when the 5th cannonball comes into the house, Duff makes a momentous decision. He decides to turn his house into a hospital. And then they don't have a house, they have a hospital. They're also going to have another child. If you watched our first episode, you'll remember that they had only one child born before the siege, little Annie, and she died when she was about 6 years old. They haven't had any other children since they've lost little Annie. They're going to have another child, There's a war going on. They've also lost Judge Lake. If any of you all remember Judge Lake, who lived at Lakemont, who was Mary's father, and he gave Duff and Mary the land to build this house on. Judge Lake served in the U.S. House of Representatives. He left the House with secession brewing. He came back to Mississippi. He ran for the Mississippi Congress. He got in an argument with his opponent, and he lost that argument. He is the last recorded death by dueling in the state of Mississippi. So Duff has a tremendous amount of responsibility. His daughter Alice, the young, was only 3 years old when he was killed. And remember, Mary's the oldest, and they have brothers in between. So Duff takes the whole extended family. He goes to a cave about 4.5 blocks north of here. Everybody was digging themselves into caves. Caves on the side of hills are natural caves. This was a natural cave that was tremendous. It had 4 entrances, and there were 200 people in it on the 6th night of the siege. We have a direct account of that night written by a lady named Lucy McRae. Lucy was a little girl. She doesn't mention her father, so I think her father must have stayed to protect their home if it was hit. He didn't go into the cave with them. Their home was Planters Hall. You know, it's still standing, so obviously he did protect it. So she says for her brothers, it was a lark, it was an adventure, they were having a wonderful time. She says she was a spoiled little girl. She didn't want to go in that cave. She was kicking and screaming. Well, I'm a spoiled old lady. I wouldn't want to go in that cave either. It was dark, there were snakes, there were bats. I wouldn't want to go in there. But Reverend Lord was there, L-O-R-D, most aptly named character in Vicksburg history. And he was quite the character. Robin, you need to get the Christ Church stories recorded about Reverend Lord, because it's a segment all by itself.
Okay.
But anyway, Reverend Lord's got a hurt foot. So he's all set up in the cave. He's got a rug on the floor, he's got a chair, he's got an ottoman for his foot, and he's got a kerosene lantern, so it's not dark around Reverend Lord. So he says to little Lucy McRae, just get down here on my rug on the ground by me. I'll sit up all night and I'll watch over us. So he gets her settled down, she falls asleep. Everything is fine until a cannonball falls directly on top of that cave, on top of Reverend Lord and little Lucy, and the cave collapses on top of them. But he saved her life. He called out that they were there. She said the first people to get there were her mother and a lady who was half paralyzed. And they just dug them out of the rubble with their hands. She said the next day, she went home all bent over, crept home. She was black and blue from the top of her head to the bottom of her feet, but she lived. She grew up, she got married, she had children, she had a wonderful life. She didn't write her story down until many, many years later, when the newspaper wanted to record the story for posterity. So she tells her story and she says, and I finished my account by telling you that at the very same moment that cannonball was falling on that cave, a little baby boy was being born in the back of the cave. William Lake Siege Green was born in the cave that night. And Siege survived. The cave didn't survive. Everybody came out of the cave. The Greens came back here. They had 2 caves built into the side of the hill out here where the new construction was going, the new houses that Tom Farr's building. They lived out the siege there. And the siege was horrible. Everything you hear about Vicksburg, everything you read about Vicksburg, you're going to hear how horrid the siege was. But finally, the town fell. When the town fell, everybody came out of the caves. The first person, the first non-military person in Warren County, Mississippi, to sign the oath of allegiance to the United States of America was a very practical young man whose fortune was gone. There was no cotton to broker, there was no cotton to move, and there was no value, or very little value in Confederate dollars. You have any ideas, Robin, on who that practical young man might have been?
Duff Green.
Duff Green. Duff Green is always the answer. Duff Green. So Duff signed the oath of allegiance, and he was never very popular after that. He made everybody at Christ Church mad at him, a lot of other people. But he had already negotiated a lease on the house with the federal government, and of course they were paying in U.S. dollars, so he was able to pay his taxes during Reconstruction. Duff was just a sharp guy. Duff and Mary were resilient people. They came out of the cave, they went to Lakemont with Mrs. Lake. They raised Siege for those 3 years, and they had another child while they were there. They named her Annie. And, if you remember, she had an older sister named Annie who had died. They named her Annie. It was very prevalent to use that same name over again. So we call her Annie too for differentiation. And Duff got a job, which was probably a political appointment. He was the wharf master. So we have all kinds of newspaper advertisements saying this boat's coming, this boat's leaving by order of Duff Green. We have all kinds of things signed by Duff Green. About once a quarter, somebody calls me and they want to sell me something for tens of thousands of dollars signed by Duff Green. And I say, well, bring it on over and we'll see if it matches everything else in this box signed by Duff Green. He signed all kinds of things. We have no pictures of Duff and Mary. We don't know what they look like. We have no idea. All of the portraits and all of the photographs in the house are my family and not their family. That we don't know what they look like. And that's because their family didn't survive. My brother's here, Willie. He likes to give the tour because he likes to hear himself talk. But he doesn't tell you anything about Duff and Mary and their story. He takes you around and he says, this piece of furniture doesn't really belong to Harley, it belongs to me. This mirror belongs to my son. He points out everything that belongs to his branch of the family, tells you all my business. But the punch bowl in the hallway is on loan to the Duff Green mansion from his daughter, Nicole. And when I was a little girl, my daddy didn't get that punch bowl. His first cousin had the punch bowl. It has a date engraved on it and some of our relatives' names. Daddy wanted that punch bowl. His first cousin didn't have any children. So every time we had an event, Daddy would take all 5 of us and line us up on her front porch to borrow the punch bowl. So finally when I got married, she said, just keep the punch bowl. So we did. So it survived because there were people there to take care of it and to want it. Duff and Mary's story, a family did not survive. To be born in the cave, Siege was killed on a runaway horse when he was just 20 years old out in front of the house. When Duff died, he was only survived by Mary and Annie too. Mississippi was extremely progressive at the time in that it allowed Mary to inherit from Duff. one of only 2 states in the nation at that time that allowed women to inherit. So she inherited the house, but she sold it, moved to a smaller house on South Street. So people ask all the time, what furniture is original to the house? None of the furniture is original because Mary took her furniture with her. And 5 years later, Annie too died of a stick pin accident. It was 1885. She was having a party in her mother's house. She was putting on a big hat with a veil, is the way I picture it. She stuck herself with the hat pin and it bled profusely. According to her obituary, there was dye in the hat. The dye got into her bloodstream and she was dead 10 days later. It poisoned her. So the family died out. It just didn't survive, but the house survived. If the house had not survived, then we would have lost Duff and Mary's story. But the first stewards of the house were the Eunice Ward Johnsons, the people who gave the money for the YMCA's. They owned the house in the very late 1800s and lived here. And when they moved to Oak Manor, I believe is the new name, Buffy and Don Nelson's house on Drummond Street that they're so painstakingly restoring.
Stained glass manor.
Well, it used to be stained glass, but they're renaming
It's called the Oak Manor.
Is it called the Oak Manor now? It's called, they're renaming it. Anyway, they are such an asset to our community, and they are saved that they have saved that
Yes,
house.
we're going to tour that
That
house.
house, wonderful, wonderful. Well, anyway, when their house was finished and they moved to that house, the Johnsons didn't sell this house. They kept it, and for 29 years, they always used it for something for the community. It was a home for destitute widows. It was an orphanage for boys. It was always something for the community. When Fannie Vick Willis Johnson died in 1931, her estate sold the house to the Salvation Army for $3,000. The Salvation Army got their money's worth. They stayed for 54 years. Which was a miracle because there was no historic preservation in Mississippi in the 30s. There was no money in Mississippi. And poverty is a wonderful preservationist. So the Salvation Army couldn't afford to tear out the ceilings. They couldn't afford to change the windows. They just used the house and kept it the way it was. By 1985, the house was in deplorable condition. A young couple named Harry and Alicia Sharp came from Coral Gables, Florida, bought the house and restored it. Harry says, they say 2 cute things. Harry says it was his dream to restore an antebellum home. Alicia says it was her nightmare. Harry also says about the restoration of the balconies, they found the foundry in Birmingham, Alabama, and replaced the balconies that Duff had melted down for mini balls. What Harry says about that is the best way to create a small fortune while restoring an antebellum home is to start with a very large fortune.
And spend it all.
And spend it all. Spend it all. But Harry and Alicia gave Big Duff Green so much. They restored it, made it a very successful bed and breakfast, a very successful venue center for 30 years. Then they had some health problems, couldn't go up and down the steps, and so they moved out of the house, and the house just began to shut itself down. When they called me to list it, I'm a realtor, and they called me to come over and see it and list it. And I just bought it instead. I just bought it. I loved it. I loved everything about it. But the most important stewards of Duff and Mary's story, and the most important people to keep that story alive today, are not the Johnsons, not the Sharps, certainly not the Caldwells. It's you all, because you're watching this. You've taken your time to watch it. Robin's taken her time to film it. And if you will tell other people about it, we will keep the Duff Green alive and keep Duff and Mary's story alive. So thank you.
Okay, so we still have a few more episodes to record. We're going to actually show some of the bed and breakfast guest rooms, and you're going to show Mary and Duff's quarters, their room, and then we are going to do an exterior, a brief exterior tour.
Okay.
We probably should have done that in November, not June, but we'll do it. We'll tough it out, Harley. So y'all tune in for some more episodes. Thank you.
Thank you.